Welcome, welcome everybody. If you haven't introduced yourselves in the chat, please do. We'd love to know who you are, where you're coming from. Hello, Sarah, welcome. You know, folks are trickling in from the breakout sessions that are just concluding. Excellent. Okay, well, I think we should get this show on the road. Hello, everyone. Good afternoon, or good evening, or good morning, wherever you are in the world, wherever you are tuning in from. Welcome. My name is Shana Rappaport. I serve as the Senior Vice President at GreenBiz and the Executive Director of our VERGE event, and it is my pleasure today to serve as the host for this Ask an Expert session, and most especially to be joined by our expert, Owen Hewlett, who is the Chief Technology Officer at Gold Standard. So the purpose of this Ask an Expert session, titled Neutral, Net Zero, Negative, What? Question mark, exclamation point, per the title, is to really help disentangle some of the confusing language around and components of net zero commitments and climate goals. A topic that has already surfaced a number of times in today's first day of our VERGE Net Zero program. It was Microsoft's Lucas Joppa in this morning's keynote program who really underscored the critical importance of having a shared definition of what net zero actually means, as well as a number of other terms that are being used increasingly. So that is why I am so pleased that we have Owen with us today to really help us move towards this alignment and to help demystify some of these questions, some of the questions that you are grappling with, by providing his unique and important perspective on the topic. Now, for those of you who have not participated in our Ask an Expert sessions before, the other primary purpose of this discussion is really to create space for all of you to bring your experiences and your questions into the dialogue with Owen. You know, the breakouts that have been happening today, hopefully you've been getting a lot of rich information and tools. These Ask an Expert sessions are really an opportunity for you to engage in the best way that we can while we're operating in a virtual context. So there are two ways that you can do that. At the top right of your screen, you'll see a little button that says Ask to Share Audio and Video. If at any point you want to join the conversation by joining us on screen, I encourage you to do that. You can just click the button and our tech manager behind the scenes, Carlos, will help you get on screen. If you would like to just pose your questions, I encourage you to do that as well. You can do so in the Q&A box on the right side of your screen. I'll be monitoring the chat throughout, so I'm doing my best to weave in your questions to the conversation. And just to be clear, this session is being recorded. It will be made available after the event. So with that housekeeping, on that note, what I'd like to do first is invite Owen to really help kick off the conversation with a bit of level setting. Specifically, why is it so important that we create alignment around both the languages, the practices, and the actions used on this journey of getting to net zero? In just a few minutes, we'll start getting into your questions. I've got plenty, but we'll make sure to save time for yours. Again, I invite you to share those in the chat or join us on screen to dialogue when the time comes. So with that, Owen, I'm going to pass it over to you to kind of frame up the conversation. Take it away.
Sure. Thanks, Shana, for the introduction. And I think the question of why it's important, I think, is in the title of this session in a way. You know, we have three there: neutral, net zero, negative. You could probably name another 3 or 4, you know, off the top of your head that people have bandied around. And I suspect if we took a straw poll of the 100 or so people in this session, you know, you'd quickly find that we all define those things slightly differently. And I look at them and I kind of see almost answers looking for a question. And we're a little bit in danger, I think, of you know, taking a term like carbon neutral or net zero and having that define the practices and actions that corporates take. And of course, it should be the other way around, right? What we're looking to do here is define good corporate practice and action. And the optimist in me, and I feel ever more optimistic about this, is that corporates are increasingly trying to do that right. They do want to take the right action, follow the right practices, and we need to align that with a good, compelling claim. So the claim itself, is where the brand equity is, but the gap between a claim and the action that underpins it is where problems like greenwashing arise, or problems like underselling yourself. You might be going further than that claim actually is, or there might be others in the market using that claim but actually doing a lot less than you, and that kind of misalignment is quite painful for somebody like me that works in climate policy and carbon markets. It also means it's quite hard to pin down the attributes of the mechanisms we're trying to design. So, for example, sitting on the task force for scaling the voluntary carbon markets, what is the purpose of buying those credits? Like, what claim and what action is that serving should determine the attributes we're talking about in that task force. So without that, I'm designing mechanisms somewhat blind, and that can't be right. And I'd say, collectively, we haven't been great at this equation of actions and claims and marrying those two things together. We're quite good, I think, collectively at saying what we don't want and what we consider greenwashing to be, because that's quite easy, right? That's quite a final, that doesn't look right, that doesn't pass the smell test. But we're collectively poor, and to criticize my own kind of side of the fence in civil society, quite poor sometimes at saying what we do want corporates to do, because that's quite scary. Because if we get that wrong and you do it, then you're going to say to us, well, you told us to do it, so what's the problem here? So we're collectively not great at that. And I think there's also this kind of morass of claims, as the title suggests, that have just emerged in the void of not being able to be clear on that. So I think to me, the answer to this is to collectively align around what good, responsible corporate practice is and means. And I suspect, again, if you took a straw poll, everybody here could name 3 or 4 things that a good corporate should be doing right now, and many of them are. And then marry that up with the right claim or claim suite, probably, for that. There's probably more than one claim here. Some of those are kind of milestone statuses. Some of them are shorter term things. So I think that's a framework that needs to exist. It doesn't exist right now. I actually feel like we're at a key inflection moment, if you like, in corporate climate strategies, where you could imagine that existing soon, finally, to kind of resolve a lot of these questions. But yeah, I think my big takeaway at the moment is a lot of these terms really are, cart before horse. What is the action we want to take, and is that reflected in the claim that we're trying to see? Yeah.
Thank you, Owen. There are so many different dimensions of this that we could get into. Each one probably deserves a 45-minute session. And again, for those who've joined us since kicking this off, welcome. This is designed as a space for you to get your questions answered. I encourage you to put them in the chat, put them in the Q&A, request to share your audio and video if you'd like to join us on screen at any point from here on out. I want to kick us off while folks are starting to generate their questions. I'd really love to start with just some of the basic language and definitions. And obviously, there's no perfect solution to this, but to the extent that this session is designed to help kind of create alignment, if any of you have differing perspectives, please chime in. But Owen, I would love to hear what your perspective, what Gold Standard's perspective is on some of the difference between some of the kind of key terms. So let's start, for example, with carbon positive and carbon negative. Very simple. What is the difference between these, if any?
Yeah, and I think, again, like this is our interpretation, really, rather than necessarily there being some Cambridge Dictionary definition of this. I think what both of those terms are trying to do is imply or convey a kind of state beyond balance, beyond your emissions being neutralized or compensated for in some way. So going further than is necessary, and it's an interesting one. So I think the kind of negative and positive is almost like a cultural war between, do you consider that to go beyond that neutrality status to be positive? And that sounds a bit simplistic, a positive sounding claim, which resonates better. But mathematically, it's negative, right? You're removing carbon, or there is less carbon in the atmosphere than there would have been. So carbon negative is the kind of more, I guess, if you're a pedant, then you would lean that way. I think in reality, neither of those has what I would say either a common practice or a legitimate definition that you could really point to and say, I'm that. But they are emerging. I think there does need to be some recognition when we look at some of the others, for example, like neutrality, like how do we recognize those that are beyond that? And that's really what those are trying to convey. But I see them as maybe the same, actually, but depending on which side you fall on the semantics. Yeah.
If you had to pick, we've had some fascinating conversations about this internally over the years, including how we frame and talk about the purpose of this event. What's your take, or Gold Standard's take, on kind of creating more alignment around the positive versus negative framing?
Yeah, I think so Gold Standard's view and my view would be, what we're trying to do is find an overarching claim for the suite of practices that corporates should follow. So not necessarily in quotation marks like a mathematical claim, but something that conveys that climate responsibility. And I'm a technical guy, so my skill set in coming up with those terms isn't the best. I mean, I quite like climate responsible, but I hear that's not the most compelling thing you could say. Climate positive has been used to term that, and I don't dislike that either. I think science-based targets went with climate positive. So I guess, therefore, logically speaking, for the more mathematical one, the going beyond neutrality, then carbon negative is more technically correct.
Yeah.
And I would prefer to avoid carbon positive, because I think we may see climate positive emerge as the thing that defines the overall practices. There you go. That was a tongue twister.
Absolutely. No, we are going to get so in the weeds on this conversation, and that's the spirit of it, right? That's where we can tease all this out and hopefully begin to build alignment. Another one, and this might get a little bit more into the practice, where I assume a number of folks who are tuned in right now have questions emerging too, which, again, kind of just staying on the language piece for a minute, is the difference between net zero and carbon neutral. Can you speak to that?
Yeah, so take net zero and carbon neutral first. So carbon neutral has been around for over a decade more, as a kind of common practice term emerging out of offsetting predominantly, where, if I emit X and I offset that with credits bought elsewhere, then I'll call like myself or that product that I've offset carbon neutral. It's not a particularly liked term, I would say, amongst the technical community, civil society, and increasingly in the market itself, because it's not necessarily that it's semantically wrong. It's more that it doesn't convey much about the wider suite of practices that need to be happening. And, again, the gap between calling yourself carbon neutral and doing basic things like just disclosing your own emissions, that's rampant for like opportunity for greenwashing, and I think people have that concern. But then in, when was it, 2017, the IPCC special, 2018, the IPCC special report started to put definitions to net zero and carbon neutral, and kind of those things are broadly the same. So net zero meaning a balance between anthropogenic emissions and sequestration, sinks, removals, and carbon neutral is effectively the same thing in definition, but focusing specifically on carbon dioxide only. So they kind of use the term in a slightly different way, and I think, again, it just shows, doesn't it? It's not actually that different, but it's different enough to have driven a wedge that says, do we mean carbon neutral in the same way as the IPCC? Because once you've got a definition from somebody like the IPCC, as legitimate as that, differing from it and using it in a different way becomes very confusing very quickly. So carbon neutral was definitely the offset claim. Net zero and carbon neutral then kind of used by IPCC. And then since then, the Science-Based Targets Initiative has been trying to put a science-based definition to net zero for companies. So net zero from the IPCC perspective was global net zero, the global economy net zero, not you or I as individuals or companies. But science-based targets, I think, looking at the short and long-term targets of companies, recognize that a translation of that at the corporate level is quite useful, because it conveys those medium to long-term versions of the target. Science-based targets is kind of got a combination of short 5-year targets in the longer term. And so they've been taking that net zero definition and applying it to corporates, but they take it in the same way as the IPCC. So the same reducing your emissions to a scenario of 1.5 degree warming and balancing that, neutralizing that with removals is the same thing. It just kind of draws the boundary around the company's emissions rather than global emissions. So yeah, that's where kind of net zero has evolved too. Yeah.
That's helpful. I have one more question while we're on the lexicon piece. If others of you tuned in have more questions, please chime in. I'm starting to see some come into the Q&A, which is great. Can we talk for a minute about carbon debt? That came up this morning in the session with Lucas from Microsoft. Can you talk a little bit about how we should understand and be aligning around a definition of what carbon debt really means?
Yeah, I was interested in this one because it's not a term that comes across my desk all that often. And I checked the specific Cambridge Dictionary definition of it, and it talks about the gap between a country's emissions and the amount they offset. But I don't think that's a very helpful definition. I think the more helpful definition is if you think of that 1.5 degree warming scenario. So this is the scenario that the IPCC said, if the Earth warms beyond 1.5 degrees, above pre-industrial levels, then things start to fall apart. Basically, you start to see the real catastrophic effects. And we're at what 1.1, 1.2 now. And the carbon debt conversation, I think, really now centers around if we sail past that in terms of the kind of global emissions budget, if you like, then what we're doing is increasing a debt for future generations to remove. At some point, just because we miss that scenario, just because we blow that budget, if you like, just like your financial accounts, somebody's going to come looking to pay that back. Somebody's going to have to pay that debt. So I think that's the kind of, I find that quite a useful definition, because a lot of the conversation in climate strategies for countries and for companies is around, well, doesn't that mean we should start investing in removals now? And yes, to some extent, that's true. But it's if you're managing your financial accounts, or like a bathtub, right? If you take the plug out but you still leave the water running, then you're not going to empty it as quick, right? So as we ramp up these removals, we also need to just stop emitting. Otherwise, we're going to be piling onto that debt at the same time as trying to pay it down. So it kind of is useful, I think, to think of that debt and what it might mean for the efficiency of the action and the finance we generate now. What's the right balance between focusing on reduction versus removals, and when is the right time to start triggering that that balance and tip that balance towards removals? It's not an easy equation to figure out, but I quite like it for that. I think it's quite a useful concept.
Yeah, well, that's actually a great transition. And thank you, by the way, Peter. Oh, I think I see you joining us on screen, Peter, for your clarifications. I think you're exactly right about the context in which Lucas was using it, and about Microsoft's commitments. Welcome, Peter.
Sorry. Yeah, I was just, I think, he was definitely putting it to his carbon negative over the lifetime of the company, which I think is a really interesting strengthening of the definition of net zero. Can you be cumulatively net zero, not just net zero as a run rate? It's almost like a waypoint you pass, but you've still eaten for free. The restaurant owner should remember that you've eaten for free for a few years. Like, can you settle your bill? And it's a really interesting one, I think, transferring potentially willing capital from global north to global south to pay for that sort of restaurant bill of the past, effectively. I think that was how Lucas was talking about it this morning.
That's super helpful. I missed Lucas's presentation, but that makes sense given the white papers that Microsoft have released, and I think it is a helpful concept, and that concept speaks to what we were saying earlier about what are the practices that good companies should be thinking about, and to what extent should one of those practices be paying down the debt to date as well as the kind of forward debt. We have to be somewhat careful as well, I suppose, that I think somebody else mentioned this in the chat already, is what point does voluntary action need to be somewhat circumspect versus just regulating this stuff? Because voluntary action itself can sometimes feel overwhelming. So if you load everything into, if you want this kind of claim available to you, then here are the 100 actions you need to take. Then many companies will kind of throw their arms up and just say, it's just too much. I can't countenance that. So I think we need to applaud Microsoft for looking at that historic debt, if you like. Is that a practice that everybody should do? It would be great if they did. of course. And I think that's the kind of thing that we need to get down on paper. Like, what is that collection of behaviors? Yeah.
Absolutely. Peter, while we have you here and with us on screen, are there any other questions or inquiries that you'd like to bring into the conversation? I got plenty more questions, but love to make space for you.
I didn't realize if you pressed the orange button, you went into the small room. I do apologize for that. No, I think that assumption of cumulative is super exciting on net zero. So to have that idea of like all scopes, all gases, and then also the idea of like emissions reduction trajectory. You were talking about coalescing, Owen, like, and this is a pivotal moment, like science-based targets as a sort of ownership of that trajectory. And then the idea of offsets. Do they have real principles, real kind of hard edge to them? Are they part of the global carbon budget? Can you kind of put them into the Paris Agreement? And then I think that fourth definition of cumulative is really interesting because it also puts a boundary around what companies are responsible for as well. And then the last piece I'd love you to react, Owen, is on net zero pathway. I think is a really interesting one, which almost like opens up that we're on a journey, we're learning. I just came out fresh from a panel with Walmart and Allbirds. It's like we're all on a journey, we're all trying to figure out together. So if you could almost like put pathway next to it, it's like we're trying to figure this out and get credit for being on net zero pathway.
I think that last point, yeah, thanks, Peter. I think that last point is great. And I mentioned in my intro, you know, it can be scary for experts in civil society and academia to say the right thing to do is X. But if you say the right thing to do is X and we're going on this journey together, and if we get it wrong, then it might be a bit more Y. It becomes a much more comfortable conversation. And I run an initiative in Scope 3 accounting, and there is no choice for that to be a pathway. Like it's absolutely absurd to expect, you know, really accurate, traceable accounting in Scope 3 for a large corporate. You know, if you're in the agri-commodity business or something, you know, the extent to which data is available at the quality you need, it just isn't there, and it won't be there for at least 5 years yet, in many cases. So you really can't just hold up action and say, well, can't claim anything then, sorry, you're just gonna have to wait till you can do it perfectly. It's just not gonna work. I think the other thing that Peter kind of, with the cumulative thing, I thought was interesting. One of the things that is kind of emerging in and around that is, so you have this, what's called the kind of the mitigation hierarchy, the climate mitigation hierarchy. It's a concept that's been around for years, which is a bit like the reduce, reuse, recycle mantra in waste. And you know, nobody would say don't recycle, but they would say, hang on, is recycling meaning we're not stopping producing plastic, right? Is it kind of causing a nudge to our behavior in the wrong direction? And it's sort of similar in climate, where we really want people to avoid, reduce, and in some way take responsibility for their residual emissions. So avoid meaning stop emitting, don't go on that holiday. That's a horrible example. Or, you know, reduce would be do go on the holiday but take the train instead of a flight, and then take responsibility would be I'll offset or I'll invest an equivalent in my residual emissions to either go, you know, kind of carbon neutral type claim or responsibility claim of some form. And I think what you're seeing with, and the reason I think this is a pivotal moment, I think there is a chance that we can get all this down in one place, is what science-based targets did finally, I think, back in 2015 in Paris when they launched, was create a proper framework for the avoid reduce part, which just didn't really exist before. So, you know, the greenhouse gas protocol is the way to account and report, and, you know, CDP is the place to disclose, but science-based targets gives you a non-arbitrary pathway, to use Peter's language. And I think if you almost nest these things like Russian dolls, for want of a better metaphor, the greenhouse gas protocol nests inside science-based targets, which needs now to nest inside a holistic framework of corporate practice that includes things like, you know, zero deforestation. It should include things like research and development, and, you know, a personal one of mine is pay taxes. You know, that's where climate finance comes from. So if we're not paying taxes, we really are robbing Peter to pay Paul at the moment. So I think that kind of the next Russian doll up, I think, will exist soon, and I think that'll be a pivotal moment in climate strategies.
Thanks, Owen. It brings up a question for me, which I'm not sure that we've addressed yet. This was one that I had captured in advance of the session, which is really kind of getting into the difference between offsetting and compensating. I think compensating is a term that we're starting to hear increasingly. Can you speak a little bit to the difference between those?
Yeah, so gold standard background for those that don't know is we were founded in 2003 to label UN carbon credits in the Clean Development Mechanism, and latterly issued voluntary carbon credits for purposes like offsetting, amongst other things like Scope 3 and climate finance. And I think for the terminology that's kind of unfolding around the claim like net zero and neutrality, there's an equal morass of terms in the mechanisms themselves, just in the act. So, offsetting is the act that leads to carbon neutral in the kind of common practice definition. And I would say I've always kind of considered compensate really to be a kind of more sophisticated version of offset. I mean, if you looked at the dictionary definition, I think it says, offsetting is the act of compensating for something. So those two things are pretty similar. We've also seen neutralize emerge, which is more about using a carbon removal. But to me, that's still a form of offsetting if it's not within your boundary. Just because it's a removal and it's acting slightly differently, it's still an act that's outside your boundary to compensate for an act that's inside your boundary, a liability that's inside your boundary. So I think those terms have a little more definition around them. It is a little bit kind of unhelpful, I think, to add to the discourse a difference in the way we think about carbon removals outside your boundary. But there's a journey to go on there in understanding as well. There's a further one emerging. So I would say, just going back a step, a really good paper to look at was WWF's corporate blueprint for climate and nature. I'm pretty sure I got those words in the right order. If you just Google WWF corporate blueprint, I'm pretty sure it'll come up. And that really is the kind of the start of the next Russian doll up, if you like. It started to put science-based targets in the context of all of the other actions a company should be thinking about taking. But it's conceptual still, right? It talks about the principles and high-level actions, but we're still away from what is the right claim and how do those different mechanisms within that work together, like offsetting and compensating, neutralization, whatever they are. But the other one it kind of threw out there, and we've been advocating for a while, is actually to think about uses of carbon credits that aren't necessarily offsetting or compensatory. So one of the things WWF proposed, which I like, is to set an internal carbon price and reinvest that, and really fulfilling the original promise of carbon markets, which is to kind of drive the marginal cost of abatement. And I think that's interesting, and it's interesting technically because offsetting towards neutrality is an easy transactional thing to understand. Setting a carbon price and reinvesting it, what's the next logical thing you say about that? I think the only thing you can do to make that fly, and this is why I think it's quite exciting, is to give a claim to that suite of behaviors and practices and actions that includes that bit. So it's not so much that the act of reinvesting leads to a claim like carbon neutrality, it's that this clutch of practices in the blueprint should lead to a claim like, illustratively, climate positive. I see somebody, thanks Tom for putting that in the chat. It is well worth a read. I think that's pretty groundbreaking. It's a first of its kind bit of thinking, I would say.
That's great. And I want to encourage folks, there's some questions coming in on the chat. Liz, Karen, Dougal, others, if you want to join us on screen, I invite you to do so. Karen actually asked a question 6 minutes ago, exactly.
I knew she would.
referencing WWF's corporate blueprint. Karen, I'm not sure that I totally understand your question, but I'm going to sort of read it as is. And it's in the Q&A portion of the on the right side of your screen. But it seems like Karen's asking around, so in step 4, the finance to unlock climate solutions and building resilience around landscape finance and climate innovation, how do companies apply to carbon neutral and net zero? If you can take a pass at addressing that for Karen.
Yeah, sure. So what Karen's referring to there, I haven't got the blueprint in front of me, but from memory, the step 4 is this part about what to do with your residual emissions. What about the bit that's beyond your science-based targets pathway? So the first thing I'd say is what that speaks to is 2 tracks, if you like. So when I think about net zero, the way science-based targets have defined it so far is that you could call yourself science-based target net zero with the following preconditions in place. You should have reduced your own emissions to a level that is in conformity with a 1.5 degree warming scenario. and you should have zero deforestation in your supply chain. And I think there were some others in there as well, but those were the two big ones. So a bit like IPCC, it's not just balancing, it's not just neutralizing. It's you have to get them down, and then you can neutralize, and then you can call yourself net zero. So that's a kind of preconditioned kind of status claim, if you like. So if anybody's claiming net zero right now, they're not net zero right now. Like there's no sort of participant in the productive economy that can possibly be at that stage right now, apart from maybe a smallholder farmer or something. So I think that is the kind of definition of net zero. Then in terms of the common practice version of carbon neutrality, or something that might replace carbon neutrality as a claim, is kind of a journey-based thing, where on the way to those preconditions, I'm a right-minded, right-acting company. I want to get to net zero. I have a plan. I'm going to get there at those preconditions in 2038 or something. Then what do I do beyond that on that journey? Because I mean, I could just do nothing else. I could just stay on that journey, and if everybody did that, that would be a result, to be frank. But a lot of companies also, you guys heard from Microsoft earlier, want to do something about their historic emissions. They want to do stuff about the inevitable residual emissions that they'll carry on emitting. The bath will keep running on their journey towards net zero. And that's where carbon neutrality fits currently. So if I offset those residual emissions, then can I call myself carbon neutrality? So step 4, I think, is in that bucket. It's the thing that is for taking responsibility for residual emissions. Whether that is will still be carbon neutrality, or whether we'll call that something else, it remains to be seen, I would say. I think the paper that putting that as step 4 is somewhat confusing in a way, because it's a process flow. Those are the steps you should go through in order of priority, but in order of the sequencing of them actually happening, actually net zero will be probably after carbon neutrality, or whatever replaces it, through the active step 4, if that made any sense.
I want to bring in a question that I think is related, and this is from Liz. Liz, if you're still with us and want to join us on screen, you're invited, as is anyone else. And it connects, I think, to what you're just talking about, Owen, which is about offsets and how they don't count currently towards science-based targets. Her question is, isn't it better for organizations to take action now and offset than wait until all direct reductions come to fruition, framing as like a better and than or? Can you speak to that?
Yeah, so I think what that refers to is both greenhouse gas protocol and science-based targets, as a kind of user of the greenhouse gas protocol, if you like, do not allow carbon offsetting towards an inventory target. So by inventory, I mean, when you report your inventory, what you're saying is, for the activities inside my corporate boundary, so the actions I take to produce goods and transport them and keep the lights on in my office, you report that inventory in emissions. And it's a snapshot every year, and that snapshot should be coming down in line with science towards a science-based target. Neither greenhouse gas protocol or science-based targets allows you to offset that against that disclosure and that target. So what you can't do in that framework is go, I produce something in the US and I'll buy offsets from a least developed country, and you can't account those offsets. Basically, you can use them beyond, and you can make a carbon neutrality claim, but you can't count them towards science-based targets. And I think what that's reflecting is what I mentioned earlier in the mitigation hierarchy, and the concern that offsetting can displace internal ambition, or conflate internal ambition with external ambition, and confuse stakeholders. And I generally support that. I have some sympathy for what that question is about. And I think what the WWF blueprint is trying to do is say, this is how those things can work together, but they should never be instead of each other. And the priority needs to be decarbonizing, within our boundary. That's how we rescue the global economy, if you like. It's not going to be the offsetting that does that. The role of offsetting, or the role of step 4, whatever that kind of turns out to be, is to accelerate that global change. But it's not a kind of an alternative to the internal abatement that needs to happen towards a science-based target, basically.
Thank you. We're coming into our final 10 minutes. If you have any last burning questions, that time totally flew by. I actually want to go back to the beginning. Dougal asked an interesting question, really around hard to decarbonize sectors, and whether there's a scope to separate avoided emission credits from hard to decarbonize sectors like steel and cement versus the avoided credits from coal plants where there are already like very real implementable alternatives today. Can you take a pass at addressing that one?
Yeah, I think philosophically this is one of the hardest and most interesting questions in a way. And if you've got a hard to abate sector that doesn't really have a science-based pathway yet because of a kind of lack of R&D or something, then you still kind of want those guys to offset, right? That's the least you want those organizations to be doing in a way. But it's not the same as a kind of a right-minded company like a Microsoft or something setting a science-based target and dealing with historical and dealing with their residual emissions on the journey. So I think there's something in both the claim and the mechanism there. Like, what is the claim for a company that does all of those actions right? But what's the claim for a hard to abate sort of energy sector that maybe genuinely trying to decarbonize, but there's all sorts of issues, justice issues around that as well. So how do we kind of provide those with a compelling claim? I mean, I think, to be honest, the answer with the hard to abate sectors is regulation. Like, there's nothing a set of voluntary claims like any of the ones we've discussed today will do to unlock heavy industry, oil and gas. The world of science-based targets, the world of scaling the voluntary carbon markets, none of those will decarbonize that sector. The only thing that can decarbonize that sector is regulation, is proper regulation. Whether there's something that can be done, because I think your heart breaks a little bit sometimes when you see carbon neutral gas or carbon neutral oil tankers. You think, it's I see what you're driving at, but it's not a great look, is it? And so there's a big part of me that just thinks those sectors need to be outside the kind of standard voluntary claims, and with the focus should be regulation. We should really focus on driving regulation to that sector.
Liz just asked a question kind of building on that. Speaking of regulation and putting an internal price on carbon, what do you think about compliance, cap and trade markets that are already doing this? It's a good question.
Yeah, I think that's a great question. I probably made it sound like some crazy new idea that WWF had come up with in that blueprint, but I mean, carbon pricing was the original intent of offsetting, right? It wasn't the offset itself. It was at what point does it become cheaper to offset versus driving down your internal emissions. Now, that promise was never realized. There's no way you could argue that voluntary carbon markets really, the price for a carbon credit really forced a company to look internally. They would just, with carbon prices, if carbon credits got to that price, they would probably just stop offsetting because it's voluntary, right? So that is an almost kind of laughable claim that we hear some occasionally now. I think that's hopefully died a death in voluntary carbon markets. The interesting thing with cap and trade, and there's people far more expert than me in this area, is that obviously you can set that price and you can set those allowances. And there were a lot of mistakes made, I think, in the early EU ETS, for example, that didn't get that right. But that doesn't make it a bad idea. So I do think cap and trade regulation, carbon tax regulation, carbon border tax regulation, these are all good mechanisms that we can use in the compliance side. I think, to borrow Peter's phrase again, there's a pathway for some of those as well. Carbon border taxes have never really been tried anyway, so we'll see. And we're going to have to adjust for those, but we shouldn't throw those regulations. If a government is willing to regulate like that, then we should go with it. I think the one thing we do need to be a little careful of is, we have a responsibility in voluntary action, voluntary carbon markets especially, to do them well, because at some stage regulated versions should supersede them, and I hope that will happen soon. Like, I don't think that can't be 10 years away. It has to be starting almost immediately, that we start to see compliance markets ramp up, and that would be a result. That would be a good thing. So we need to make sure that in voluntary action we don't somehow almost ruin the reputation of markets for compliance when it kicks in. So we don't do it badly, and then the public loses faith in them. And then therefore the compliance version itself never really gets off the ground. That's kind of a thing that we have to take responsibility for, I think, in voluntary action.
So much that we covered today. We're coming into our final 5 minutes. Thank you all for your questions. Carlos has pinned a chat at the top of the pinned a survey at the top of the chat box. We request that you share your feedback with us. We're always wanting to iterate and improve, figure out how to do that better, and how to do these better, and we can't do it without your feedback. So please do take a minute to share your feedback. I want to take a minute just before we close out, Owen, to just kind of step back. We've gotten very granular in the weeds. I think we've just scratched the surface on detangling, some of the language and terms. I'd like to invite you to kind of reflect on where we go from here, and specifically what a framework would look like to drive this kind of alignment forward. And you can speak to some of the work that you're doing at Gold Standard, and also just your perspective more generally about what's needed from here.
Yeah, no, thank you for that. And indeed, we have commenced work on a framework to that end. And the thinking there is we need to distill this into a much simpler guidance. It can't be 100 pages. It needs to be 5, and that's practically impossible. But that's where we're going to try and hit. Like, can we make the start here part of the guidance short? And then the technical nerds like me can get under the hood of what makes an offset, and what makes, is there a difference between neutralization and compensation and offset? Like that's really for folks like me to worry about in the background. But what's really needed, I think, is the principles of good corporate practice set against then what a claim is for those principles. And so what I'd like to see, and what we hope to do, is to create a framework that can cope with company practice, products, events, funds, whatever else, I suppose, but those would be the big obvious ones, I guess. And I think the right way to do that is in a kind of modular structure where you say the principles of good practice are X, Y, and Z based on the avoid, reduce, take responsibility schema. But then how you apply that to a company, or how you apply that to an SME, or how you apply that to a product or an event, they're not going to be the same, right? What is the science-based reduction pathway for a product compared to a company? You wouldn't work that out in the same way. But that is the kind of work that needs to be done. So what I'd really like to see is 2 things. One is to align behind some common, easy to understand good practice principles for companies to follow, and for them to follow in things like how to develop their products and have that brand equity, and couple that with an all-encompassing claim that kind of explains that. Because I think we can get a little obsessed. I mean, net zero is important, but we can get a little obsessed with longer term targets when really what we need is those practices now, that collection of practices now. So that's what I'd like to see. And then we can do an awful lot of playing around then on the pathway, to quote Peter for a 4th time, on how we do that in those individual kind of scopes like products and events and companies, and evolve those over time. So yeah, my greatest wish for the next sort of 6 to 12 months is a clean, straightforward to understand set of corporate principles, coupled with the beginnings of alignment behind a compelling brand equity leading term that honestly reflects those principles. And what that term is, that's where my comms colleagues will pile in. you don't want to ask the technical guys what the claim should be, but yeah, I feel confident that's realizable, if that's a word. Yeah.
Well, I love that, Owen. I often like to end conversations by inviting people to reflect on a year from now when we come back to have the same conversation. Where do you hope we'll be? I think in a way you just answered that. Are there, I'm wondering, folks who are tuned in, if they want to connect with you or connect to learn more about Gold Standard's work, if you'd like to include your information here, or if there's anyone else from the Gold Standard team who'd like to include that in the chat. I imagine folks might be interested in learning more about the framework and how they can plug in.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, I guess if I could ask everybody to think about something, is what do you think those corporate principles should be? Like, what do you, not as a business actor, but as a kind of citizen of the world, if you like, think corporates should be doing right now? Is a question we should all be doing, and I'd love to start collecting those ideas. I think the best place to find me is on LinkedIn. If you just search my name, I'll come up. There's not that many Owen Hewletts. I think there's a cricket player somewhere in the UK that's got the same name as me, but there's not many other people. So you should find me pretty easily, and go from there. Feel free to DM me. I kind of run a lot of conversations on LinkedIn as well in public for people to pile in on. I might ask that question, what do you think corporate principles, and then maybe people can answer that on LinkedIn, and we can keep the conversation going.
That's great. Owen, thank you so much for your time and for staying up very late in UK to be a part of this conversation. It was really great to hear your perspective. Thank you all to everyone for joining and for your participation. Welcome to the Verge NetZero community. We can't wait to see you again here next year. Continue digging into some of these big, hairy issues. I'm sure we won't have solved it all by then, but no doubt we will have made a lot of progress thanks to all of you and your leadership and the leadership of your organizations. So with that, thank you all so much. Owen, thank you so much for serving as our expert on this thorny topic. Looking forward to seeing you all again soon. Thank you.
Thanks, Shana. Thanks, everybody.
Bye for now.